All right, ready to dive into some seriously complex stuff today.
Absolutely. Always up for a good philosophical challenge.
That's what we like to hear. So today's deep dive is taking us into the world of naturalistic epistemology.
Oh, a fascinating area for sure, where science and philosophy really kind of collide.
Yeah, and we're going deep with this one, our main source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Excellent choice. It's the go-to resource for this kind of stuff.
For sure. Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar with this, what exactly is naturalistic epistemology, or NE for short?
Well, think about it this way. Instead of just sitting around theorizing about how we should think, any looks at how our brains actually work, you know? It's about getting real about knowledge. Like, how does it actually happen?
So instead of relying on pure reason and logic, it's about looking at the nitty-gritty of our cognitive processes.
Exactly. It's like, instead of just reading the car manual, you actually pop the hood and see what's going on in there.
I like that analogy. So we're getting down and dirty with the mechanics of the mind.
Precisely. Now, to really understand the any approach, we need to contrast it with what's often called traditional epistemology.
Right, the classic approach. What are the key differences?
Well, traditionalists are all about logic, thought experiments, a priori reasoning,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. They believe that you can figure out a lot about knowledge just by thinking things through, without needing to run experiments.
So they're big on the power of pure reason, like armchair philosophy.
Pretty much. They
Uh-huh.
see epistemology as its own, independent domain, separate from science.
Right, so they wouldn't necessarily look to psychology or neuroscience for answers.
Not really, no. And they're also very focused on setting standards for knowledge, like what makes the belief justified, what are the rules for good thinking, that sort of thing.
So they're like the guardians of good thinking, trying to protect us from bad arguments and false beliefs.
Exactly. And of course, they're constantly wrestling with, that age-old problem of skepticism, the idea that maybe we don't really know anything for sure.
Right, that classic philosophical conundrum. So how does NE shake things up? Where does it depart from this traditional approach?
Well, Annie comes along and says, hold on a minute. We can't just ignore science if we really want to understand how we know things. Our brains are products of evolution shaped by natural forces.
So why not use the tools of science to study them?
Exactly. Tools like psychology and neuroscience can help us see how our brains actually function in the real world.
Instead of starting with these abstract principles, NE starts with, well, us. Messy, fallible humans.
Exactly. And this leads to some really interesting and sometimes kind of controversial
Ooh,
questions.
like what? Give us a taste.
Well, for instance, can certain beliefs, actually be unreal based on how they were formed in our brains? Or how do facts about, our brain states connect to what we consider justified beliefs? This is the kind of stuff that what we call meta-epistemic NE is interested in.
Okay, that's a mouthful. But I'm starting to see how this shakes things up. It challenges some fundamental assumptions about how we acquire knowledge. So how did this whole NE thing get started? Who were some of the key figures who pioneered this approach?
Well, one of the most influential figures was W.V.O. Quine. He really kind of threw a philosophical grenade into the mix with his famous paper, Epistemology Naturalize.
Sounds dramatic. What was his main argument?
He basically said, look, traditional epistemology has been trying to find like this rock solid foundation for knowledge for centuries and hasn't really gotten us anywhere. So he proposed something radical. Why not just let psychology take over? After all, everything we know ultimately comes from our senses and how our brains process those sensory experiences.
So instead of endlessly debating what knowledge is in some abstract sense, let's just study how we actually get it, how we come to know things in the real world.
Exactly. Quine argued that we should focus on the process of how our minds actually construct an understanding of the world based on sensory data. It's like, studying how a house is built rather than arguing about the abstract definition of a house.
I love that analogy. It makes the whole thing much more concrete and, well, down to earth. But what about the skepticism problem? Did Quine just sweep that under the rug?
Not at all. In fact, he had a pretty interesting and some might say radical take on it. He claimed that skepticism itself is, get this, a product of science.
Whoa, hold on, explain that one.
Well, think about it. Things like optical illusions, right? They show us that our senses can be fooled, but those illusions are themselves scientific discoveries.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So we can use science to both reveal the limits of our knowledge and understand how we overcome those limits.
Exactly. Quine even used Darwinian evolution to explain why our inductive reasoning, generalizing from experience, might actually be generally reliable. Creatures who are consistently bad at making inferences from their experiences are less likely to survive and pass on their, less than stellar reasoning abilities.
Right, so natural selection would favor those who can draw accurate conclusions from their experiences. It's a pretty compelling argument.
Yeah.
But I imagine Quine's ideas weren't exactly met with universal applause, right? There must have been some pushback from the traditionalists.
Oh, absolutely. There were, and still are, plenty of criticisms of his view. Some philosophers argued that he was attacking a kind of straw man version of traditional epistemology, oversimplifying things a bit to make his point.
So maybe he didn't fully appreciate the nuances and complexities of the traditional arguments.
Perhaps, yeah. Another big criticism is this issue of circularity. Can we really use science, which is based on observation and reasoning, to validate the very tools of observation and reasoning themselves?
Yeah, that does seem like a bit of a philosophical knot, to say the least.
Right, like trying to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And then there's the ever-present normativity problem. Does Quine's focus on what is leave any room for what should be?
Right, that question of norms and standards for good thinking. Does he just say, hey, whatever our brains do is fine, even if it leads to false beliefs?
That's the worry some critics have. It seems like by just focusing on the mechanics of how our minds work, you lose that evaluative dimension, that ability to say what's good reasoning and what's not.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant concern. But before we get too deep into the critiques of Quine, let's maybe turn to another major figure in E, Hilary Cornblythe. He offers a somewhat different take on things, right?
He does, yeah. Cornbreath is really interesting. He pushes for a more thoroughly empirical approach to epistemology.
What does that mean in practice? How does his approach differ from Quine's?
Well, Cornblath argues that we should study knowledge as a natural phenomenon, just like biologists study a species or physicists study gravity.
So instead of analyzing concepts in the abstract, he wants to go out into the world and observe how knowledge actually works in practice.
Exactly. And he draws a lot of inspiration from cognitive ethology.
Okay, now you're going to have to explain that one. What in the world is cognitive ethology?
Basically, it's the study of animal cognition, how animals think and learn, but in their natural environments.
Ah, so we're talking about observing how squirrels remember where they buried their nuts or how birds navigate by the stars.
Precisely. Kornblythe argues that by observing how animals, including humans, learn and adapt in the real world, we can uncover some fundamental principles about knowledge, principles that might not be accessible just by sitting in our armchairs and, speculating.
So it's about getting out of the ivory tower and into the field, so to speak.
Exactly. He thinks this kind of grounded approach gives us a more realistic and maybe even more well-rounded understanding of how knowledge actually works. And this whole emphasis on real-world learning leads Kornblythe to what's called a reliabilist view of knowledge.
Okay, so what does that mean, reliabilist? Break it down for us.
Sure. So he argues that, it's not enough to just have a true belief. You got to have a true belief that's produced by reliable processes, cognitive mechanisms that consistently lead to accurate information about the world.
So it's not just about getting lucky and stumbling upon the truth. It's about having, like, a mental system that's generally good at tracking the truth.
Exactly. Think of it like a finely tuned instrument. Like if your thermometer consistently gives you the right temperature, you can trust its readings. And similarly, if your, cognitive processes are consistently giving you true beliefs, then you've got knowledge.
Right. So it's about the reliability of the process, not just the outcome. Makes sense. But doesn't this, bump into that same normativity problem that Quine faced?
Right.
How do we know which processes are actually reliable? Do we just observe what our brains do and say, well, that must be reliable because it's what we do? That seems a bit circular, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And Kornblythe actually tries to address that head on. He argues that we all have pragmatic reasons to want a cognitive system that's reliable.
In what sense?
Yeah.
What do you mean by pragmatic reasons?
Well, think about it. No matter what your goals are in life, right, whether you're trying to, I don't know, build a bridge or bake a cake or write a philosophy paper, you need accurate information to succeed.
Sure. You need to know which ingredients to use or how the laws of physics work or what other philosophers have argued, right?
Exactly. So valuing truth and having reliable cognitive processes, it's kind of practically grounded in our very desire to achieve any goal at all.
Okay, I see. So from a practical standpoint, it makes sense to want a mind that can reliably track the truth. If you want to achieve your goals, you need to be able to figure out how the world works. But some philosophers might push back and say that this doesn't really give us a strong enough foundation for, those robust epistemic norms that we're looking for.
Yeah, you're right. It's a tricky issue, and not everyone's totally convinced by Kornblythe's
Yeah.
response. But his work definitely raises some really, really important questions about how our cognitive mechanisms relate to our goals and how those in turn shape our understanding of knowledge.
It definitely adds another layer to this whole debate, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So we've got Quine saying, let psychology take over, and we've got Kornblythe pushing for this uh, thoroughly empirical approach. Where does someone like Goldman, who you mentioned earlier, fit into all of this? He seemed to be staking out a bit of a middle ground, right?
Right, Goldman, yeah, he's trying to find a kind of middle path. He calls his approach moderate naturalism.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? What's the moderate position here?
Well, he agrees with the naturalists that epistemology can't just ignore science. It needs to be informed by, what we're learning about the mind from psychology and so on. But he doesn't think we should throw out traditional philosophical methods altogether.
So he's not ready to hand over the keys to the psychology lab just yet.
Not entirely, no. He thinks both approaches have something valuable to offer.
Okay, so how does he propose to, bring these two approaches together?
He proposes what he calls a two-stage model of inquiry.
Okay, love a good model. What are the two stages?
So in the first stage, we use those, traditional philosophical methods, things like conceptual analysis, to clarify our basic concepts. Like, what do we even mean by knowledge or justification? What are the core features of these concepts?
So we start by, getting clear on what we're even talking about before we go running off to the lab.
Exactly. We need to define our terms, lay the groundwork. Then in the second stage, we turn to empirical science, especially psychology, to figure out, okay, which cognitive processes actually lead to knowledge, which ones lead to justification.
So it's like we create a philosophical blueprint and then science comes in to do the actual construction work.
I like that. That's a great analogy.
So it's a collaboration, a kind of philosophical scientific partnership. But even with this moderate approach, there are still some potential sticking points, right? Like that whole debate about intuitions, for example. That seems like a pretty big one.
You hit the nail on the head. Intuitions, those kind of gut feelings we have about, philosophical thought experiments and whatnot, they play a huge role in traditional epistemology. But for the naturalists, this reliance on intuitions is, well, it's a bit suspicious.
Yeah, because if our intuitions are just subjective opinions or gut feelings, how can we be sure they're actually tracking the truth? It seems like building a house on, a foundation of sand.
Right, exactly. And now there's this whole new field that's emerged called experimental philosophy, which is basically using empirical methods like, surveys and experiments to study how people's intuitions about these philosophical cases actually vary.
So instead of just assuming that everyone shares the same intuitions, they're actually going out and testing it.
Precisely. And some of the findings are, well, they're pretty surprising. It turns out that intuitions can be quite diverse,
Yeah.
Varying across individuals, across cultures, even across gender.
Wow, so that really kind of throws a wrench into the traditional approach, doesn't it? If the very foundation is shaky, how can we build a solid structure of knowledge on top of it?
Right. It's a serious challenge, and it's particularly problematic for someone like Goldman, who's, trying to hold on to those traditional methods while also embracing empirical findings. If our intuitions are all over the place, how can we be sure that conceptual analysis is actually revealing anything objective about knowledge?
Yeah, it seems like the rug is being pulled out from under him a bit. So does this mean we have to throw out intuitions altogether, or are we just stuck with this jumble of subjective opinions?
Not necessarily. Recent research has also found that some intuitions are actually quite robust and consistent across cultures.
Oh, interesting. So it's not a simple black and white story. Some are reliable, some are not.
Right. It's more complicated than that. And this is where things get really, really interesting. Figuring out which intuitions are actually trustworthy and which ones are just, misleading biases, that's a major challenge for both traditional and naturalistic epistemologists.
It's like we need a kind of intuition filter, a way to separate the wheat from the chaff, to distinguish genuine insights from, those pesky biases.
Exactly. And I think this is an area where the collaboration between philosophy and science can be really, really fruitful. By combining, the conceptual tools of philosophy with the empirical methods of science, we can start to develop a much more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of how intuitions, function in our pursuit of knowledge. We can figure out when to trust them and when to, take them with a grain of salt.
Sounds like there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah,
This whole discussion has really opened my eyes to the complexities of, well, of how we know what we know. And it's not just about abstract theories. It's about understanding how knowledge actually works, in the real world in all its messy glory.
that's the power of any, right? It pushes us to move beyond just armchair theorizing and engage with the complexity of the world, of how our minds actually interact with that world.
So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear a bit more about those other areas of epistemology you mentioned earlier, social epistemology and feminist epistemology. How does NE influence those fields?
Oh, great question. Any is like branching out in all sorts of fascinating directions. Social epistemology, for example, it looks at how social factors like, testimony or group dynamics or even things like social media influence what we know and how we know it.
Right, because we're not just isolated individuals figuring things out on our own. We're social creatures, and our knowledge is shaped by our interactions with others.
Exactly. And feminist epistemology takes this a step further by looking at how gender biases and, social structures have actually shaped our understanding of knowledge and reason itself.
That's really interesting because, those traditional views of like objectivity and reason, they often kind of ignore the perspectives and experiences of marginalized groups, right?
Absolutely. And feminist epistemologists are challenging those views, arguing for a more inclusive and, a more socially aware understanding of knowledge. And many of them are actually drawing on these naturalistic insights to develop their theories.
So it's like Annie is providing new tools for thinking about how, power dynamics and social structures actually shape our understanding of the world.
Precisely. It helps us to see knowledge not just as this, product of individual minds, but also as a social and cultural phenomenon. And that has some pretty profound implications for how we think about everything from education to scientific research to, even political discourse and social justice.
Wow. Yeah, this is really expanding my view of what epistemology is all about. It's not just about those those abstract theories anymore. It's about understanding how knowledge operates in the real world in all its in all its complexity and messiness.
Exactly. That's the power of the naturalistic approach. It challenges us to really get out there and grapple with the world as it is.
I love it. This has been an incredible journey so far, but I have a feeling we're not quite done yet. There's still so much to explore. You mentioned earlier that NE is also kind of shaking things up in debates about rationality. What's going on there?
Well, traditionally rationality has been seen as this idealized capacity for pure logical thought. Think Spock from Star Trek.
Right. All logic, no emotion.
Exactly. But Annie challenges us to look at rationality through a more empirical lens. How do people actually reason in the real world?
So less Spock, more, well, actual humans.
Right. And what the research shows is that people often make systematic errors in their reasoning, especially when dealing with things like probabilities and statistics.
So our cherished view of ourselves as these perfectly logical beings is taking a bit of a hit.
In a way, yeah. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. Some argue that these findings just show that we need a more nuanced and realistic view of what rationality is.
So instead of holding ourselves to this impossible standard of perfect logic, we should acknowledge that we're always going to be influenced by things like emotions or heuristics or social pressures.
Exactly. And NE can help us understand those influences better. By studying how our brains actually work, we can develop strategies for improving our reasoning, for making better decisions, even though we might not ever be perfectly rational.
Right. So it's not about achieving some kind of, superhuman rationality, but rather about becoming more aware of our own, our own cognitive quirks and learning to work with them to compensate for those biases.
Exactly. It's about being more mindful of how we think and, being open to revising our beliefs when we're presented with new evidence, even if that evidence challenges our deeply held intuitions.
Okay, so Any is really pushing us to rethink some pretty fundamental assumptions about knowledge, about rationality, even about, ourselves as knowers. That's a lot to take in. But I gotta say, I'm finding this whole approach really refreshing.
I'm glad to hear that. I think it offers a really valuable perspective on some of these, these enduring questions in philosophy. It's not about dismissing those traditional approaches entirely, but rather about like enriching them with the insights of modern science.
It's like we're opening up these new avenues of exploration, new ways of understanding how we like make sense of the world and our place in it.
Exactly. And I think I think that's incredibly exciting.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the the big unanswered questions in NE? What's keeping you up at night?
Oh, there are so many. One of the big challenges is figuring out how to integrate the findings of these different sciences, like psychology, neuroscience, even evolutionary biology, into a coherent picture of human cognition.
So it's like putting together this giant jigsaw puzzle, but the pieces come from different boxes.
Exactly. And then there's the perennial philosophical challenge of bridging the gap between the descriptive and the normative. We can describe how our minds work, but how do we get from there to figuring out how they should work? How do we derive like ethical and epistemic norms from a purely naturalistic perspective? Those are questions that are still very much up for debate.
Sounds like it's a field that's bursting with potential, but also one that faces some pretty tough philosophical challenges.
Absolutely, and that's what makes it so fascinating. It's a field that's constantly evolving, constantly pushing the boundaries of what we thought we knew about knowledge, about reason, about the human mind itself.
Well, this has been an absolutely incredible deep dive.
Mhm.
I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective uh, on epistemology and, you know, maybe even on myself as a thinker.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. That's what we hope to achieve with these deep dives, to spark curiosity, to challenge those assumptions and hopefully inspire some deeper reflection.
Well, you've definitely succeeded. For our listeners out there, if you're intrigued by these ideas, I highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on naturalistic epistemology. It's a great starting point for further exploration.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to dive into those primary sources too. Quine, Kornblythe, Goldman, these are all, philosophers who have written extensively on these topics, and their work is, it's both challenging and incredibly rewarding.
It's like a treasure trove of intellectual adventures just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. So keep those minds curious, keep asking questions, and, keep exploring that fascinating world of ideas.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this intellectual journey. Until next time, keep learning and keep questioning.